Hello everyone, this is part 4 in my series on the Whac-a-Mole model. That's the management game where, leaders will focus on one problem at the exclusion of all their other operations and improve that, but everything's gone to hell over here, so then they go try and fix this up, and then they move back and try and fix this up, and they kind of go back and forth and never really create a stable environment, which is like the arcade game Whac-a-Mole, where you're constantly moving from place to place. So now we're on the fourth part of the series, or part D. This is where we ended last time, which is we're going to talk about product results, is kind of one balancing loop, and service results. So you have a product and a service, and you're trying to optimize both of those. So in the product results, we have it improving because you spend time on it as a manager, and it erodes just through the normal kind of course of business. It erodes. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of finish off this model, and then we're going to get into Excel, or this section of the model, I should say. Okay. So what causes you to spend time on the product? Okay. If you think back to our causal loop diagram, you have a product goal. And basically the results are not meeting your goal. Okay, so there's a gap to the goal. So most balancing loops have a goal, and they have a gap to the goal, which drives action. So here's the product goal. Combination of results and goal will give you the gap to the goal. And that gap to the goal will drive you to spend more time on the product. So that essentially kind of finishes off the causal loop diagram. And now what I'm going to do is, there are two tricky variables. One is, how do you translate when you have a gap? Let's say we're 90% of our goal or 40% of our goal. How does that translate into how much time you spend on the product? And I wanted to revisit in a different way from last time the amount of time you spend on the product. How does that translate into improvement? The rest is really easy math, but those are the two tricky factors to do. So when you have these kind of they're sometimes called table functions or translation functions. You graph them, and so I'll show you these two graphed. Okay, the first graph we're going to do is the gap to the goal and how that relates to how much time you spend on something. So the input parameter I put on the x-axis, and instead of gap, I'm going to actually do the performance, which is the goal divided by the result. The result divided by the goal. So if you're at 100%, you're meeting the goal. If you're at 90%, you're 90% of the way to the goal, that sort of thing. So x-axis is your performance, 0% being the worst, 100% being you're meeting your goal, and I guess you could be above your goal as well. And then on the y-axis is what you want to determine, which is how much management time you're going to spend on something, depending on where you are with your goals. So, okay. So what I usually do is, I think of what happens, and then I pick a couple data points. So the essence of Whac-a-Mole is, you're a leader, things are going well, you're meeting your goals, then they start to erode, but you don't do anything about it. They go down to 90%, they go down to 80%, they go down to 7%, and then you freak out. And you move from spending very little time on that operation to spending a lot of time on it. Okay? So that's the basic thing that I'm going to graph. So if you're at 100%, so you're meeting your goals, so again, I pick a few data points. So 100% of meeting your goals, let's say you spend 20% of your time on that operation. You're meeting your goals, you don't need to spend a lot of time on it. Okay? So that's one data point. Like I said, you drift down to 90, 80, it's not till you get to 70 that you really freak out. So that's what I'm going to model. So 90, 80, 70, you know, you're not spending that much more time on it. All of a sudden you get to 70, you freak out. Let's say you spend 80% of your time on your goal. Okay? So it kind of looks like this. And then even if your performance gets even worse, you're going to go up to 100%, let's say. Okay? So that's basically the translation function written on a board. We need to convert it to Excel, to taking your performance, kind of your gap to your goal, and translating that to how much time as a manager you're going to spend on it. Okay? So that's one tricky function. I'll show you how to do that in Excel, but part one is to basically graph it on the board like this. Okay, the next one this one is, okay, you're spending time on your problem. How much does it improve the situation? I did a very simple table in the last video, which is useful. But what you find is when you do these tables that have these big jumps, it looks like a staircase on a graph, sometimes the model doesn't act really appropriately. So it's better to have more of a smooth curve if you can, or a more complex curve. So this one again is you're spending time on the product, so that's your input. Your input, your x-axis is management time, and your y-axis is your improvement rate. So again, let's pick a couple data points. 0 is a good one. If you spend no time on it, it will not improve. Okay, so that's a good one. Let's say if you spend 40% of your time on it, let's say it'll improve at 20%. Okay, so it's a good amount of time on a particular operation. It's going to improve 20%. Is a good improvement rate. And if you spend even more time, you know, there's a bit of diminishing returns. So let's say at 80% of your time, so you're spending almost all your time, it improves 30%. Okay, so that's a few data points, and there's no unusualness to this. So it's kind of a smooth curve. It's not linear, but it's kind of a smooth curve. Okay, so each of these are kind of translation functions that we'll need to model in Excel to get this thing to work. But once we've done that, we have the whole model for product. We just need to copy that for service and connect it together, because in this model you only have 100% of your time. So you're either spending time on one or spending time on another, and we'll see how the whack-a-mole effect actually occurs. Okay, so let's walk over to the computer. Okay, great. Now we're back to Excel. We're going to model what I just put on the board in Excel here. Okay, so as usual, I posted a picture of our updated model. You can get that slide on the site there. So first of all, percent of management time on product is no longer a variable. So I'm going to get rid of that row. We're going to do this differently, as I explained. So we're going to get rid of that. Get rid of the purple. Okay. And for reasons that I won't explain, I'm going to change this to every 2 months. Because it just, actually I'll explain it. It just takes the model too long to have its effect if you do it every month or every year. Okay, so and also we're going to start with 100 instead of 80, and our new constant is product goal. So put that up here, product goal, and our goal is 100. Okay, that is a percent, a real 100. And any constant, give a name up here, product goal. Okay, now we have some more fun in between. So product results, we're first going to calculate the product, the gap to goal. I'm going to do it like I did on the board, the product performance as a percent. So you take our results, divide that by our goal, and that should be how we're doing as a percent of the goal. So right now we're at 100, the goal is 100, so we're at 100%. So that's the product performance.
now the performance will drive the percent of management time on product. Percent, yeah, it goes down here. Percent of management time on product. Okay, here's where we're going to take that graph that we saw on the board and somehow convert it into Excel. So the way you're going to do that is percent performance, basically, and percent management time. Okay? And what we're going to do is with any of these tables, you got to start with 0. So we'll do 0%, 10%, all the way up to 100% in our table. We'll even do more than 100% because sometimes you exceed your goals. And then management time, if you recall, at 100%, we're going to spend 20% of our time. Let's say above 100, we'll also spend 20% of our time. If our performance is at 0, so we have no results whatsoever, that would dictate 100% of your time. And if you recall, we're going to be a little bit lazy. So if it's 90%, we're still going to spend 20%, 80, 70, and then we're finally going to wake up if it drops down to 60%, and we're going to spend time on this. So we're going to climb our way. We're going to overreact. I've got some numbers here, and I'll show you what they look like. We're going to overreact right away, and then smooth our way up to 100. And again, I'll show you. I meant to type these as percents. I'll show you what that looks like and how to adjust these things. Okay. All right. So what you want to do is graph this. So to graph a table like this, you do insert, scatter a graph, and I do the one with the lines. Okay? And that should be that'll give you what the table looks like. So this is what we drew on the board. Basically 20% and then a huge panic up to 80% of your time. You can see the 80 basically around there. And then kind of a smooth up to 100% of your time. So basically the way to do this is this is active. So if I typed in 70% here, I could see that would drop. So I want to do 95 or 96. So you just play with these numbers until you kind of get a smooth curve like you want. So that's the way to do these tables. You do a scatter graph on the right, and you just play with the numbers until you kind of have something that looks like what you drew on the board. Okay, so that's table number 1. You have to name these tables. So you select the range, and we'll call this management time table. Okay, so we'll go back here. The percent of management time on the product is a VLOOKUP of that 100%, the product performance, look up that 100% in this table, and return column number 2. Okay, so that correctly is saying if the product performance is 100%, we're meeting our goal, we're only going to spend 20% of our time on it. Okay, so that's that. Now what we need to do, if you look at our diagram here, is the percent of time on the product will yield a product improvement rate. So what I said on the board is I'm going to make that slightly more complicated to show you one other trick. So let's start with another table, which is percent of time we spend and improvement rate. Okay, so we said if we spend 0% time on it, again, always start with 0, your improvement rate is 0. If we spend 40% of our time on it, improvement rate is 20%. And if we spend 80% of our time on it, improvement rate is 30%. Now, if we just use this table, it would be a little jerky. It would be 0 for a while, and then it jumps to 20 and jumps to 30. And the reality is there's plenty of numbers in between, kind of like this line, that you're going to want, what if it's 30% time, what if it's 50% time? You're going to want a reasonable improvement rate. So the two options are to do a more detailed table like this to try and get a smoother series of dots, or the other is to actually do this as a function. And let me show you how I do that. So I do the same deal where I'm going to graph it. So insert, scatter, that one. So that is basically what we saw on the board. Okay. And what you can do is, it's a little tricky, but you click on that, you do add a trend line. Okay. And if you move this over, you can see the trend line. So it starts with a linear trend line, and that's not quite what we want. We want it to have that shape. So you can do a polynomial, and you can do up to 6 orders, but actually the second order looks pretty good. So I'll do a second order equation. It intercepts at 0, 0, so I select this box, and I also display the equation on the chart. And that part's important, as you'll see in a second. So that's the equation to take the percent time and turn it into an improvement rate. So what I'm going to do is copy this equation and just use it over here. So what am I calculating? I'm calculating improvement rate, which is already there. Okay. So instead of this VLOOKUP like I did before, I'm going to paste in this formula. And the main thing you need to do is replace it with cell references. So C8 squared plus that times C8. Okay, so if we spend 20% of our time on the product, we'll get 11% improvement. And so you look over here, yep, that looks about right. So our equation worked. Okay. All right, so I had an extra line I don't need. That's our improvement rate, so let's recalculate the stuff. So product improving is 100 times the improvement rate. We're going to divide by 6 because it's every 2 months. I'm going to change this to divide by 6. And our model is kind of done. We're going to adjust it in a second because I've already worked ahead. Okay, so let's take a look. Ending product results, insert, line, boom. Okay. So what happens is your product starts eroding because you're only spending 20% of your time on it. And then it just kind of sits around 70. 70, you start to wake up and do stuff. But then you do stuff and it goes above 70, and so you relax, and it goes below 70, and you act, and it goes above. So the reality is that's actually not how people behave. What would normally happen is you have ignored a problem. When it gets to 70, you're going to stay at it till it's back at 100. Okay, that's how most people react. So in a sense, you act differently on the way down from the way up. So as your results are declining, you're not paying that much of attention. But if you're on the improvement track, you're going to drive them up to 100, drive them up to your goal before you start to focus on other things. So that makes it a little complicated. In a sense, the formula for going down is different than the formula for going up. But I'll show you how to do that. So basically, there's essentially 2 formulas. Percent of management time on the product if the performance is declining. Okay, and we'll calculate another one. Percent of management time on the product if it's improving. So I will add a row that asks whether it's improving or not. Yes, no. So I will say if this is greater than that, then yes. Otherwise, no. Okay. All right, now let's write this formula. If it's improving, basically, what I just said is that you're going to stick with the same time that you're spending on the product. So percent of management time on the product. So the time is really going to be if that is no, use the declining formula. If it's yes, use the improving formula. We haven't written the improving formula yet, but trust me on that. We'll get to that. And then just fix this. This needs to point to our new percent of improvement on product. So C11 instead of C9. Okay. So to write that last formula, I usually like to write the formulas when they're interesting. And this is interesting when we hit that first 70. So you can see it's dropping, dropping, dropping. I'm looking at row 15. You can see it's dropping and dropping. And it's right here in month 27 that we wake up. Okay? And let me freeze pane so you can see that a little bit better. View, freeze panes. Okay. So going over to 27 here. Okay, so if it's improving, what we want to do is see how we jumped up. We were spending 20% of time on it. We jumped up to 78. So what I'm saying is we want to sustain that 78 until this is at 100, until we're back to our goal. So I'm going to say if this is less than, actually I can say if this is less than 100%, then stay on the same percent of time on the product that you had before. Otherwise, you can drop back down to 20. Okay? So now I'm going to copy that around. See if that works. Okay, so let's see what happened. Well, that actually looks more normal. So you dropped down to 70, you woke up and you started spending your time on this particular problem, and you drove it back to 100, and then you started to ignore it again. So it dropped down, it's going to go up, that sort of thing. So that is, that's the product results. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the whiteboard and recap this, and I'll do one more video to hook everything together. All right? Okay, I hope you followed all that. I know that's a lot of Excel, and it is kind of complicated the way we take a graph that's not that hard to do and turn it into Excel. So you can either do those VLOOKUP tables, and it's important to do a lot of data points sometimes to kind of match the curve that you want. Or you can use those trend lines to actually do a formula and then just copy that formula into a real Excel style formula. So that's it for this video. I promise there'll be one more. Actually, I can't promise that, but I'm going to aim for one more to finish the whole Whac-a-Mole thing and talk about what to do about it. Okay? Thanks.